immediate and complete reports of local blood and guts.
What happened was true. The most bizarre and brutal series of crimes
No doubt when it comes to true crime, often what many would consider the worst of the worst is crimes against children. And they'd be right. But where most people are wrong is when they begin labeling predators as the worst, because, in my mind at least, there always is a bigger fish, or, in this case, a bigger monster. With that being said, in the realm of true crime and internet extremes, Peter Scully is often regarded as the world's worst pedophile, or world's most evil child predator, who is said to have created the most shocking and violent child exploitation clip ever. But only part of that is true. While Scully is indeed an evil monster, Daisy's destruction is far from the worst piece of child exploitation out there. The notion that it is the worst purely comes from media sensationalism surrounding Scully and his arrest. The sad truth is, Daisy's destruction, by description, is considered pretty mild in terms of violence and abuse material. And if that's the case, it's a painful thought to imagine something worse, right? Who could rival such atrocities? Another man in Australia, who is still to this very day free, never been caught, and some authorities believe is still active. A man dubbed Mr. Cruel. The investigation into Mr. Cruel's crimes was one of the largest and most exhaustive in Australian history. The Victoria Police formed Task Force Spectrum, dedicating countless hours to finding the elusive criminal. Investigators sifted through thousands of tips, interviewed numerous suspects, and followed every lead, no matter how tedious. They employed advanced forensic techniques and even sought the expertise of international law enforcement agencies. But despite these extensive efforts, Mr. Cruel was never caught, and his true identity remains a mystery to this very day. In the quiet suburbs of Melbourne, Australia, a specter of fear once prowled the night, or perhaps still does. This is the story of a man whose crimes left an indelible mark on the psyche of a nation. Mr. Cruel is a frightening and intelligent predator. It's believed he spent copious amounts of time casing out his victims. It became clear as time went on that he learned his victims' schedules as well. He knew exactly when his first victims fell asleep. On August 22nd, 1987, around 4 a.m., a man wearing a balaclava and armed with a knife and handgun entered a home in Lower Plenty, a suburb in Melbourne, Australia. The man would methodically intimidate and tie up both parents, binding them by their hands and feet and verbally guiding the home invasion as just a robbery. However, to their horror, as the parents were bound, they quickly realized the man was heading towards their kids' bedrooms. The intruder tied the young boy to his bed frame and then went to the room of the family's 11-year-old daughter. There, he sexually assaulted the child and disappeared. And by the time the parents could free themselves, the intruder was gone. The phone lines were cut, and this would be the first confirmed attack from a man they would call Mr. Cruel. It would later be revealed that Mr. Cruel was most likely active even earlier than 1987, as far back as 1985 at least. The first victim was a 14-year-old girl who was abducted from her home in Hampton in February of 1985. During her assault, the attacker told her,
"My liberty, my freedom is more important than your life."
Fast forward to 1988, Mr. Cruel would attack yet another family. On July 7th of 1988, an article appeared in the Melbourne tabloid, the Sun News Pictorial, which detailed the story of a house fire which occurred at the home of the Wills family on the 5th of July in the outer eastern Melbourne suburb of Ringwood, which detailed the story of a house fire which occurred at the home of the Willis family on the 5th of July in the outer eastern Melbourne suburb of Ringwood. The article titled "Mother Battles Blanket Blaze" by Paul Cunningham described how 36-year-old mother Julie Willis had responded to cries from her 4 daughters while in the middle of a phone call. When she arrived in her daughter's bedroom, she was greeted by the frightening sight of one of the top bunks of the bunk beds completely on fire. Mrs. Willis had ordered her daughters, Sharon, age 10, Linda and Robin, age 8, and Annette, age 5, outside as she unsuccessfully attempted to put the fire out. The fire brigade were called, but the fire still caused quite a lot of damage to the house. Accompanying the article was a photograph by Carl John of 4 girls, and Mr. Willis holding up the cause of the blaze, a faulty electric blanket. Sharon Willis is pictured on the far left of the photograph, standing on the bottom bunk bed. Just 5 months later, Sharon Willis would be abducted from her family home and subjected to unimaginable torture. During the early morning hours of December 27, 1988, around 6 a.m., a man broke into the Willis family home and headed straight for the parents' room to begin what would be his routine. He would bind the parents together and declare that all he wanted was money. This was purely to gain control, for shortly after the parents would comply is when their nightmares would become a reality. Mr. Cruel bound the Willises together, put them face down on their bed, and then headed straight for the bedroom of 10-year-old Sharon Willis and her 3 sisters, aged between 5 and 8, who were still asleep. And after about 15 minutes, the parents were unable to untie themselves, and Mr. Cruel was gone. And so was Sharon. The phone lines were cut as well, a scene straight out of a horror movie, but this was the MO of Mr. Cruel. By the morning of December 28th, Melbourne daily news outlets were reporting on the abduction, with the Sun News Pictorial publishing a story on their front page titled Kidnap Agony, detailing a plea from the parents to free their daughter, as well as noting that Mr. Cruel also took some of Sharon's clothes. The story went to press before it was realized that Sharon had been released around midnight that morning. She was found by a woman driving past Bayswater High School, and according to the driver's husband, his wife found Sharon running around in the street at the corner of Orchard Road and Armstrong Road when she was returning from work just after midnight. The man said that it had been raining and the woman stopped to check if the girl was all right. When Sharon told the woman she had been abducted, the woman took Sharon back to her house and called the police. It was 18 hours since she was taken from her home. She was silenced with a ball gag and duct tape was placed over her eyes when she was taken. And this is how the other kids did not wake up. Mr. Cruel had assaulted the child multiple times before eventually dumping her on the side of the road, but this was far from his last victim. In fact, his brutality would only escalate, and on July 3rd of 1990, in Canterbury, he would break into another family's home, this time around 11:30 p.m. The same MO, balaclava, knife and gun, phone lines cut. The 13-year-old Nicola Linus was gagged and tape placed over her eyes, and her sister Fiona was tied to a bed. Nicola was then taken to another room where she was made to grab a change of clothes. Nicola and her sister had been alone in the house while her parents were having dinner with friends. Mr. Cruel told Fiona that he would only release her if their father paid a ransom of $25,000. He had then forced Nicola to get into the family's vehicle, which was later dumped. The kidnapper did not tell Fiona how to tell her dad to pay the ransom or any other key details that would make sense in this kind of situation, which indicated to police that this was another misdirection, as was all of the robbery involved with these attacks, as Mr. Cruel's prime motivator was sex. Nicola Linus was assaulted for over 50 hours before being dumped near a power substation. Over $200,000 in rewards were offered for information leading to the arrest of Mr. Cruel. However, if you count the other suspected attacks, the amount climbs to over $1 million. The next attack would demonstrate a level of depravity from Mr. Cruel that would only solidify the worst fears in any parent. On April 13th of 1991, Mr. Cruel would abduct a child from Templestowe, a suburb in Victoria, who went to the same school as the Canterbury victim. He would break into this family's home and run his routine, but this time the victim would not see her parents again. Carmaine was a Chinese-Australian citizen. The Chan family owned and operated a lucrative Chinese restaurant and Chinese takeaway business, with both parents regularly working up to 18 hours per day, with Carmaine being the eldest of the 3 siblings. This left her in charge of babysitting her younger sisters, Carly and Karen. On the afternoon of April 13th, friends of the family drove Carmaine and her sisters to the Lower Plenty Chinese restaurant their parents operated, where the sisters ate an afternoon meal with their mother before an employee drove the sisters home at approximately 6:30 p.m. The sisters spent approximately 1 hour at home with their father before he left to attend to business needs at the Lower Plenty restaurant, just 10 minutes away from their home. According to Carly and Karen, their sisters then read stories to them before all 3 sisters watched a special about Marilyn Monroe in Carmaine's bedroom on TV. But around 8:40 p.m., the girls encountered a man dressed in a green tracksuit, wearing either a dark blue or dark green balaclava, brandishing a large knife in the family hallway. And then for 50 grueling minutes, these children were traumatized by Mr. Cruel. Karen and Carly being forced into a wardrobe by knife point, barricaded with one of their beds. And by 9:30 p.m., Mr. Cruel would leave the scene with Carmaine in tow. She would not return home. Investigators later determined Carmaine was led across the family garden and tennis court through a security gate and onto Circles Road, where she was almost certainly forced into an unknown vehicle parked close to the family home. At some point, the other 2 Chan sisters freed themselves shortly after, and at around 9:45 p.m., they made a phone call to their father, with Carly shouting that Carmaine was missing. Their father rushed home to discover Carly and Karen cowering in the laundry room. He briefly searched the house for his oldest daughter before reporting her kidnapping to police, who arrived at the home within minutes. A police investigation found the kidnapper tampered with electronics of a security gate to gain access to the community, and at some point spray-painted "Asian drug dealer" and "payback" and either "more and more to come" or "more anon, more to come" on the family's Toyota Camry in the front yard. No ransom was demanded for the return of Carmaine Chan. Despite this, the Chan family made several pleas for her safe return, but these pleas would be ignored. Around 24 hours after the abduction, media outlets began reporting on the incident and connected it to Mr. Cruel with information from authorities on the case, confirming that to be the case. Carmaine Chan's decomposed body with 3 gunshot wounds to the head was found a year later. The psychology behind Mr. Cruel is equally terrifying and fascinating, as he clearly exhibits great intelligence and cunning, and possibly could have a career in law enforcement as he has avoided capture for over 30 years. Police describe Mr. Cruel as highly intelligent as well. He meticulously planned each attack, even telling Nicola Linus that she would be released in 50 hours. He also bathed each victim, thus the change of clothes each time, and conducted surveillance on their homes, their families, and knew exactly when they fell asleep, all while making great strides to make sure he left no forensic traces, despite the time when DNA forensics could be described as shoddy at best. And he also left red herrings to divert family and/or police attention, like the car graffiti. It's said that he was soft-spoken and his behavior was unhurried. During one attack, he took a break in a victim's house to eat a meal. He threatened to injure his victims or their family members with a knife or handgun. Mr. Cruel also concealed his identity by covering his face at all times, most notably at least in the abduction of Nicola Linus, a rather unique balaclava, dark green with cream stitching around the eyes or mouth. Mr. Cruel is believed to have videotaped and perhaps taken still photographs of his attacks, as Sharon Willis and Nicola Linus peeked under their blindfold and saw a camcorder pointed at them, as they were being abused. Detectives believe that if he is still alive, he would have kept the recordings and/or photos and would still collect new things to this day, and possibly swap child exploitation material and child sexual abuse material online. He also kept trophies of his victims, mostly articles of clothing. They say he almost certainly continues to collect via the internet, possibly on the dark web, and may communicate with children using chat lines. Sometime in 1991, Melbourne authorities put together a task force to catch Mr. Cruel. But despite searching over 30,000 homes and interviewing 27,000 suspects, no arrest was made, even with the descriptions of Mr. Cruel's bedroom and bathroom. And then the task force disbanded in '94. Fast forward to 2010. On December 14th, police announced that a task force has been established about 8 months earlier following substantial new leads. The new task force has been reviewing both the Spectrum Task Force investigation from '91 to '94 and some new leads that had surfaced in the last year or so. This new task force, dubbed the Apollo Task Force, ended up closing in June of 2013 after finding the intelligence was not credible, ruling out the suspect. However, this doesn't mean that Mr. Cruel has remained silent all these years. 3 years ago on Reddit, a user made a post on r/Unsolved Mysteries claiming that their stepfather may have in fact been Mr. Cruel. Hi, fellow Redditors. Not too sure if this is even where I should be or even if I should be posting this. It's been on my mind for many decades now, at least 30 plus years, and it has always terrified me. Although I have no definitive evidence, the coincidences are just too much. To start with, I am only mentioning all this because I know it's anonymous, and if it wasn't, there is no way I would even consider mentioning any of this in a public forum. I grew up in an extremely abusive household. My mother displays narcissistic personality disorder. My stepfather is a pedophile, and his eldest son is an alcoholic, a compulsive liar, and is also a pedophile. Sadly, I know this from firsthand experience, and I also know that I am not the only person that was afflicted by their attentions. My mother did nothing about the situation. In fact, she often deliberately put me in compromising positions, like leaving me in their custody or turning a blind eye when she had undeniable evidence that something had occurred. Although this group is about unsolved murders, and not other forms of abuse, it will all make sense as this is all entwined. When I was about 11 years old, I lived in the state of Tasmania in Australia. My eldest stepbrother had moved to interstate Victoria to join the army, and I was just relieved for the break from his presence. When he completed his basic training, my stepfather and mother went for a trip to Victoria to watch my stepbrother, quote, march out, which is a ceremony at the end of their training to signify that they were now full serving members of the Defense Force. They were gone interstate for approximately a 2-week period. My dates are not 100% accurate, but they were gone from late August to somewhere in mid-September. I remember this clearly because once they came back to Tasmania, they had nothing but praise about mainland Australia, as Tasmania is an island state, and they wanted to move there. We were packed and ready to move very fast, and were gone in just over 2 weeks after the return. We arrived in Melbourne on the 5th of October of '87. Not long after we moved to Melbourne, there was an awful case on the news about a man who was abducting young girls from their homes and abusing them. One of his last victims that I was aware of was a young girl named Carmen Chan. Although I was so young at the time and often ignored whatever stories were on the news of a nighttime, this stuck with me because we often ate dinner with the television at the time. And whenever something came on about the news media about Carmen Chan and the abductor that the media had dubbed Mr. Cruel, my stepfather would snap at me and insist that I shut up and keep quiet while he listened. He would turn the television up louder, and I became very focused on whatever the news was reporting. Mr. Cruel had abducted a few girls leading up to this point and mostly just assaulted them before he left them somewhere. They would be discovered and returned to their families. However, in Carmen Chan's case, she was never returned and eventually was found deceased. My stepfather's abnormally intense interest in the news surrounding these cases always confused me, as he most certainly did not concern himself with my welfare, and there was plenty of violent news on television for him to absorb, so I had no idea why he was so interested in Mr. Cruel. He did have some other peculiar interests, as he used to own a collection of booklets printed about serial killers in our home library. I did not read them all as I was too young and really had no interest in the subject at the time, but I remember a book about Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy, etc. Of course, this is not illegal to possess, and it's on its own. It's not entirely suspicious, but if you combine it with the rest of my post, then perhaps it will appear to be a little dubious. Anyway, It wasn't until I was much older that I started to question as to why my stepfather seemed so interested in Mr. Cruel at the time. And that's when I started to read up on what little information the police had on the criminal/murderer. They believed that he was in the defense force, I think because of the way he was so clean and left behind no evidence, or minimal evidence at best. At the time of these abductions and murders, my stepbrother was in the army, but my stepfather was also a manic neat freak. He would make me wash the hubcaps of the car with a toothbrush when I was cleaning the car, and one day he even had a meltdown because I left a tiny ink mark on the front page of a newspaper while I was checking to see if a pen was working. His tidiness was a compulsion. One piece of physical evidence that apparently Mr. Cruel left behind was a whisker, a facial hair whisker. So the police thought that they were looking for a redhead because the whisker was red. Both my stepfather and stepbrother are brunette unless they grow facial hair. They both have red facial hair. The police also thought that their suspect was either from Tasmania or New Zealand due to some colloquialism language that abducted girls heard. I cannot recall the exact phrases that was related to each media. I just know that when I read it at the time, I recognized it as something my stepfather and stepbrother used. They often use colloquialisms such as, "How do you like them apples?" or "How does that grab you?" in a sadistic, condescending tone. This is just a couple of the many they used. Also, at the time of the abductions and the abuse/murder, all of the victims were female, and all of them were the same ages as myself. Lastly, the last coincidence that comes to mind at the moment is the timeline. From what I read in the media, they believe that the first abductions from Mr. Cruel occurred sometime in either late August to mid-September of 1987. I cannot recall the exact date, I just remember how ill it made me feel to know that both my stepfather and my stepbrother were both in Victoria at the time of this happened, and that the last victim they believe Mr. Cruel abducted was either in September or very early October of 92. These dates are important because against my wishes and against my stepfather's wishes, my mother insisted we move back to Tasmania, and we left Victoria on October 5th of 92, just after Mr. Cruel's last apparent abduction before he went quiet in Victoria, Australia. Around the same time that we moved back to Tasmania, my stepbrother moved from Victoria to Queensland, so now both my stepfather and stepbrother were no longer in Victoria, although both of them had been there during the times that Mr. Cruel were active. Both my stepfather and stepbrother have a sadistic streak, and I honestly believe that after living with them for 13 years that either one of them was quite capable of doing those acts. My stepbrother, however, was a little skittish and anxious when he was being abusive, but my stepfather always kept his composure. At the times that Mr. Cruel was active, we lived in northern suburbs of Melbourne, which is where Carmen Chan's body was found, and so did my stepbrother. Her body was found only a couple of suburbs away from where we resided. My stepfather does not appear to fit the physical description of Mr. Cruel, as he is quite short, but my stepbrother does. It would not even surprise me if they acted, if it was them, as a pair, because of each of them knew each other's sadistic fetishes and behaviors, and each of them covered for each other. At the time that Mr. Cruel was active, I would also like to note that at least one of his victims stated that they would hear airplanes overhead when they were abducted. We lived in the northern suburbs of Melbourne at the time, not too far from an international airport, and underneath the flight path of many of the flights. Also, one of the descriptions of a room that one of the girls was kept in matches up with what I can remember of one of my stepbrother's rooms when he was living out of our home for a while. My stepbrother never lived on barracks when we moved to Melbourne. He either rented his own place or he moved back in with us for a while. The only time I recall he lived on base was just before we moved back to Tasmania. And at this time he was married, and was working as a chef at a communications depot because this depot was so small and in a rural area. And because he was married, he was provided a house on the depot site to live off with his wife at the time. Because he was only a chef and the depot was so small, he was the only chef that I was aware of, so it was essential that he be available on site to cook breakfast, lunch, and dinners. So living at the depot was pretty much essential. I also recall his really odd behavior, which may not have anything to do with this case, but it was not uncommon to find him vacuuming his house or hanging washing out the back to dry at 1 a.m. This may have something to do with him being a chef and working hours that were different than most, just getting household chores done when he could. But he was also an extreme neat freak, and I hated spending time there to keep his wife company because as a 16-year-old, I did not appreciate being woken up to help vacuum or hang washing up so late at night. I mentioned all of this to a police officer years ago. All I can recall is she was part of a task force at the time. She did ask me to get back to her, but I had a house fire and lost her contact details. Since then, I've never been able to locate them again, and I have no idea what her name was. I really don't remember, although I wish I really did. I truly believe that one of them, if not both of them, were involved in this whole Mr. Cruel incident, and it terrifies me to think that perhaps their dislike for me or their passion to be sadistic towards myself in possibly any way, they chose targets that were brunette, the same age of myself. There is a saying in Australia which is, you don't shit where you eat, which means if you're going to commit a crime, you don't do it in your backyard because it's just too close to your home. So the thought of them lashing out at these young ladies instead of myself is just sickening. Of course, I have no definitive proof on me, or they or he would most certainly be in prison as I type this. Obviously, I have nothing to do with them at all anymore. Whenever I was abused, it was either psychological and sadistic, which is just impossible to prove to authorities unless there is a non-biased witness or the abuse never left any marks on my body, which again is pretty difficult to prove. My mother once told me that when I was 14 that if I ever went to the police she would lie, and that she asked me who I thought a judge would believe, her or a teenage girl. I was terrified to go to the authorities because I thought no one would believe me, and then the aftermath would be much, much worse for me. Since then, however, I have had my stepbrother charged, and he did end up spending some time in jail for some of the crimes committed against me, although most of them have gone unpunished. I don't hold any malice about that, and I'm impressed that Victorian police were able to put together a case on what information they had, and that they were able to charge him at all. This does not alleviate any concerns of mine about the Mr. Cruel cases, though. There are so many coincidences that I find frightening. 1. The intense interest in the media coverage of the cases. 2. All victims being the same age and same hair color as myself and same gender. 3. Living in the approximate area where he was committing the crimes. 4. The facial hair being the same as the sample found at the crime scene. 5. Their colloquialisms that match Mr. Cruel's pattern of speech. 6. The time frames that Mr. Cruel was committing his crimes matched the times that both of my family members were in Victoria. 7. Living in the northern suburbs, we live close to the international airport and underneath the flight path of many airplanes. 8. My stepfather's compulsion for tidiness and my stepbrother being in the army at the time of Mr. Cruel's active spree. 9. Mr. Cruel's activities seemed to cease when both my stepfather and stepbrother moved to interstate from Victoria. 9. Mr. Cruel's activities seemed to cease when both my stepfather and stepbrother moved interstate from Victoria. 10. My stepfather's fascination with serial killers. 11. My family coming from Tasmania, as the police believe that Mr. Cruel was either Tasmanian or from New Zealand. This is an awful lot of coincidences concerning one case or one offender. All of these coincidences don't really amount to a criminal case, but it has left me terrified, feeling ill, and with no one to talk to about this. I did try to mention it to my biological father once a few years ago, but I think he just thought perhaps I was overreacting, as he was not aware of the abuse I had endured as a child. I never told him about any of this, even when my stepbrother was charged and went to jail. My biological father had no idea why, and had no idea that my mother was aware, and that his father was also a part of it all. I can't shake the horrible feeling that I feel like I was raised by a serial abuser. Well, that one I know is a certainty, and a murderer who had no problem in taking the life of a young girl. I know that either of them are capable of such actions, although if I was asked to choose which one I thought would be most likely it to be, the physical attributes matched that of my stepbrother. But the calmness of Mr. Cruel is something that was more often displayed by my stepfather, so I don't really know. But I am sure that it is one of them, if not both of them were involved in the case. I just don't know who to approach and who will take all of this seriously. I also have a family of my own now, and I don't want them to hear about any of it. I have to be careful because I don't want to expose my children to these kinds of images or thoughts. Lastly, I would like to add, for those who question as to whether or not my thought processes about this situation are stable, I had to be psychologically assessed as part of the legal requirements when I had charges pressed against my stepbrother. The courts needed to assure that the person making those kinds of allegations are mentally aware of their accusations and that there are no signs of mental illness where they may have been misinterpreting the situation, etc. Yes, there are psychological effects. I suffer from PTSD, but honestly, if you knew the true horrors of the home I grew up with, then you would be amazed that anyone could endure such an upbringing and walk out of the home without any emotional baggage. If anyone who reads this knows a person amongst the Victorian Police Task Force who would be interested in talking with me, I have no problems with this and would appreciate a way to contact them. As I type this, I'm sitting here shaking as I recall my old home and what those poor girls had to endure, and poor Carmine, who probably did nothing wrong other than to view his face. My heart goes out to her family, but I am so scared that even her family would bear a grudge against me. Even though I had nothing to do with their whole situation, and was the same age as Carmine, grief can make someone view perspectives differently. I would be ashamed to face them unless I was able to assist them in getting some kind of justice. I have not mentioned any names other than Carmine Chan, who was one of his victims. I have not mentioned exact suburbs or exact information. As if this is of interest to police, I don't want to jeopardize any possible investigation and outcome by posting information publicly before an official investigation is done. Nor do I want to cause any possible biased opinions, as this could affect the outcome of a court hearing. I'm not saying that my step-family members will ever be charged or go to court or that they are definitely guilty, but I will not take the risk of ruining any chances of possible justice just so I could tell my story on Reddit. Thanks for reading. Perhaps someone will respond with some kind of information or advice. Diving into this claim, however, this user has not given any further update, and just a year later, a report came out claiming Mr. Cruel may have been spotted and without a mask. A woman came forward with a bold story. Approximately 6 weeks before the masked intruder abducted and assaulted her friend, Sharon Willis, the woman says her brother saw a strange man filming into the victim's house over the back fence. She describes how the house is backed onto a large clearing for high-tension electricity towers, saying, "The area that the houses are around is specifically for power lines. No kid would play up there apart from my brothers. There's no reason for anyone else to be up there. It's dangerous." This led to authorities beginning to link the electric power industry and substations to Mr. Cruel's routine, and brought forth the possibility of him working for said industry. There was one more user on Reddit that caught my attention as well. They made a Reddit post claiming they too may have been raised by the infamous predator. This post was from April of this year, 2024, and it reads, "I have some suspicion that my dad is Mr. Cruel. I'm not sure how crazy this will sound, but let's try and get some opinions. I was born in 1985. My memories are very vague and distant. I don't exactly remember the story on the news, but as soon as I saw the photo, I knew I had been face to face with it. Anyway, let's get to my reasons, and here are my top 10. 1. The locations of the assaults were all places near where my dad had worked. 2. Occasionally my dad would borrow from family members a video camera, but I never saw him use it. 3. He drove the same make and model as described in the articles I read. 4. There is violent and sexual assault offenders in my family history on my dad's side. 5. I have a blank memory from my childhood where I got out of bed to find someone and saw something that caused me to run, and my dad chased me. By the time my mother saw this, I couldn't remember what I had seen. This led to my parents' divorce approximately 6 months later, which corresponds perfectly with Mr. Cruel's final kill. 6. The police released many sketches over the years with different hairstyles, etc. based on witnesses. One in particular is virtually a photo to my father. 7. My dad is weirdly obsessed with food. He always has been. He would always make sure he ate and everyone around him ate. He would virtually force feed. So Mr. Cruel always feeding victims and himself makes sense. 8. The way it is reported Mr. Cruel acts, personality-wise, describes my dad. 9. While he never touched me sexually, he would glare, stare, and check out me and all my friends. He would insist on reaching over them to put their seatbelts on. 10. My dad is deceptively intelligent. He's very good at science. He would be the sort of person to know exactly how to not leave a trace. So am I nuts for thinking this could be a possibility? The user posted an update stating, "Update. So I've educated myself about the case and contacted the police. The 2 names I provided were on a list. It's being investigated. However, once again, no arrest has been made. And while I do not wish to discredit any of these claims as they may be victims themselves, I do believe them to be credible, somewhat. However, I propose a different, arguably more terrifying theory regarding the Reddit post specifically. Given the sheer amount of trial predators in our world, with some dark websites boasting tens and thousands of active members at a time, is it so far-fetched to propose that maybe those fathers are not Mr. Cruel himself, but another predator altogether? Perhaps not. This all could be very well Reddit roleplay on a very disgusting subject, as especially with the most recent post here, there's far less detail in some of these claims, and really it's just circumstantial at best, connecting some shoddy family members to a case. Take point 3, for example. He drove the same make model as described in the articles I read. Doesn't even specify what, why, or anything. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean anything, but the lack of detail and care to this here just kind of discredits it to me. There are still plenty of stories and theories making various claims surrounding Mr. Cruel, including a terrifying theory that in 1996, Mr. Cruel traveled to Boulder, Colorado, and kidnapped, raped, and murdered John Benet Ramsey, and even recorded the abuse. This is corroborated with statements from both Sharon Willis and Nicola Linus claiming they have heard planes landing while in captivity. Nicola Linus told detectives that she could hear planes banking after they passed over her. Nonetheless, Mr. Cruel has not been caught, and with the FBI and Australian authorities believing him still to be alive and active on the dark web, it suggests the equally harrowing possibility that there are more like him. More predators who have or still abduct, torture, and maybe even kill children, all while recording it for the pleasure of themselves, or maybe others. To me personally, as a father, Mr. Cruel is literally the epitome of what a nightmare is to a parent. The concept of a home invasion itself, just a burglar terrorizing your home in general, is pretty damn scary. But take into account the fact that Mr. Cruel's intentions purely were sex, to abuse children, and in the case of Carmine Chan, that led to murder. Mr. Cruel still not being caught gave me an idea that is entirely based in theory, but I would still like to share it because it's somewhat interesting. I don't have any evidence to support this, so don't take it as anything but a theory, please. But regarding the Ripper Group, an infamous group of pedophiles and child abusers who are like, well, for lack of a better term, comparable to Anonymous in how they gather and then just simply disappear, is a very real and harrowing boogeyman in our world. What was once thought, at least by me, to be just a singular individual committing terrible, terrible acts and making compilations of the worst variety, ended up being something far worse. An organization that was being looked into far beyond me even knowing about it. With some members being in Europe, with members all across the world, and one particular person of interest being a physician in Germany. He is believed to be a producer of child sexual abuse material. The fact that this group exists and functions the way it does and has for how long really puts into perspective on how dark things can be, and really just plays onto the idea of Mr. Cruel possibly being involved with the group himself. If you think about it, maybe his acts, yes, were all him, but were for different purposes as well. Not all sadistic freaks like him act alone. The first Reddit testimony was far more credible in my opinion and posed the possibility of two assailants being the stepfather and stepbrother of the victim. Being the stepfather and stepbrother of the user. The child predator Ripper Group itself, in fact, was based off of a serial killer group. Yes, a serial killer group. Men with very sick habits of necrophilia, and even cannibalism in the end. And of course, rape. A terrifying thought indeed, but like I said, it's just a theory. So with this ends my take and my deep dive into Mr. Cruel. Thank you so much for watching. And remember, if it bleeds, it leads.